Hello, everybody. I am here for another episode of Digital Agency Real Talk with my co-host, Celene Hoag. Welcome, Celene.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here. I say that every week, and every week I say it every week, but every week it's also super true.
I know, I feel that. I'm like the queen of stoke. I'm like, I'm stoked on this, I'm stoked on that. She just start talking about what,
Well, it's been so long since we've recorded an episode that I am really, really stoked. I haven't done this for a while.
It is true. We got so good at batching them that we didn't batch any for a very long time. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh crap, we're not going to have you for a while. We need to batch a whole bunch of them again. Awesome. So Celene, how do you feel about change?
So I personally hate change and I'm terrified of it, but I love it as a concept. Just kidding. I really do. I like and I value change. I don't necessarily handle it or adapt well to it, which is probably why I've spent so much time thinking about how to handle it and adapt to it. And in case you've never ever heard me talk or met me, I'm just a tiny bit of an overplanner. So
well, not only do I vibe with you super hard on that, but honestly, I feel very similarly about change in the sense that it can be so good and I can love it, but also it's kind of terrifying and I don't want it, even if it's just like small things or like basic things that are changing that don't really necessarily affect my life. I think that this is a pretty common perspective on change. There's like that weird mix of like, oh, this could be good, or it's absolutely terrifying. So that's why we're going to be talking about it today.
It's funny that you should mention that because I'm actually way better at handling really big change than I am at handling small change. I recently got a new phone, and even though it was a phone, it's a really good phone. It's a phone I wanted. I did all the research. I'm like, it feels different. The buttons look slightly different. The sounds, the notifications are different, and the notification sounds I had on my old phone aren't available in this one unless I search and down. Anyway, I actually spent several hours searching and downloading the same sounds as my old phone.
That's when over planning meets fear of change.
Yeah, but throw me a big life curveball, and I'm like, great.
I feel you. I don't know. I can relate to that. I sometimes do pretty good with the small changes, and sometimes I do not so good with the big changes. But our goal here today is really to discuss handling change. Both of us spend a lot of time thinking about this, planning around it, and understand how we can handle change better collectively and as individuals and all that fun stuff. So what brought this up, Celene?
Well, originally, this episode was inspired by COVID because there was obviously a ton of change going on, and it was constant change too. It wasn't just here's one change and now you have to adapt to that one change. It was also unknown. Every day, every week, everything was changing. Projections were changing. So what you were planning for was changing. And so that was, a very extreme example of a lot of big change happening. But change is a fact of life, and it comes in so many forms, whether it be a major life event, business partner leaving, economic crisis. For all you listening to the podcast who probably don't know, I'm having a baby soon. That's a major life change. That's a really good, exciting change, but it's still going to require, a lot of adapting, especially, at Anansi, because I won't be here as much for a little while.
Oh, I know. I know. And we in some ways, and I was saying this to you last week, it is, yes, absolutely terrifying, but it also can be really, really cool because a lot of the processes and systems and stuff that we're doing to kind of anticipate and shift around this change are actually propelling us into the future in kind of a faster way and a different way than we would have otherwise. And that's really exciting. But at the same time, it's uncomfortable to shift out of the status quo, to shift out of what's been working for us.
Yes, and we spent so much time of our quarterly planning this quarter talking about all the different kind of systems and what it's going to look like without me being there. And I think a lot of these are going to be long-term changes, even when I'm back, that we're just improving our systems and processes and stuff, which is super, super cool. I know I'm a nerd, but I think it's really exciting.
Absolutely. And I do think that is part of the benefit, if we're talking about some of the benefits of having a process or having, some plans or tactics or strategies around handling change, is that it can become not so much okay, we just need to survive this change and get through. And it can actually be that opportunity to say, okay, as this change goes on, how can we use this to propel ourselves into greater maturity as a business instead of kind of having to change in that direction, then change in that direction, change in that direction, you know, with this particular type of change, and we'll get into different types of changes in a moment, you know, because it is expected and we're not just kind of trying to pretend it's not happening until the last moment, we can not only ease the burden of transition, but we can actually set things up so that, you know, as time goes on and as you come back, things are actually way cooler and way better and way more efficient than they were. And not just run around like chickens with their heads cut off for a while. That's the goal. Anyway.
This is definitely the easiest type of change, expected change, to deal with, because you know it's happening, you know it's coming. And in this case, you know, you have a very like good approximate time that it's happening. So it makes it really easy to plan for compared to other types.
That's true. That's true, because there's still some stuff that can kind of like change or adapt, but we know our window, right? Like we can give ourselves X amount of leeway or et cetera, versus when COVID hit, it was like, you know, one day, okay, yeah, I'm going into the city and going to all these events. The second day, maybe that's not such a good idea. The third day, that's definitely not allowed. And the fourth day, wow, I'm probably not traveling anywhere for the next like 6 months to 2 years. Anyway, but drawing us back here. So you talked about expected change and your mat leave being, you know, a change that is concrete in terms of time. It might be flexible a little bit, but we know approximately when it's happening, what we have to do to prepare. What are some other types of change that come up in life and business, Celene?
So I guess the like opposite of expected change would be unexpected change, a sudden change. This is harder because sometimes you're completely blindsided. Whether it be like an employee who and maybe they're probably, if this would happen, there's probably warning signs, but there's no warning sign and they're like, yo, I'm out. Or maybe they have a family emergency and they have to leave. Or, you know, it's basically you're reacting to it after the fact. You're not in control. You're not planning for it. The change has already happened and you're kind of left trying to deal with it. Yes.
Not like any of us have experienced that kind of change in the past 6 months to a year or anything. Anyway, depending when this episode comes out. All right, so sudden change. We've got expected change. We've got sudden change. What else have we got?
Well, there's also slow change. So these are things like industry trends, or things that sometimes they happen so slowly that you don't even notice they're happening. A lot of times things shift, and because the shift is so slow, you kind of realize it after the fact. And sometimes these changes can be hard to catch. Maybe you are noticing, you know, that maybe because there's data or something else, you're noticing the change as it's happening and you're kind of following the trends and deciding when to step in or start thinking about it. Or sometimes like the slow change is kind of it's happening and it's in the rearview mirror. And one day you wake up and you have a pager and nobody else has a pager. And you're like, how do I beep you? I don't even know how pagers work. But you know,
yeah.
I mean, that was probably pretty easy to catch type of slow change, but there are things that happen so slowly that sometimes you become obsolete without really realizing it.
Yeah, you know, I think this is a big one and kind of an important one because slow change actually happens surprisingly quickly sometimes. Like, for example, I have this iMac that I'm working on. In my brain, it's a very new computer. It was purchased maybe 2 years ago, like I want to say mid 2016. That was not 2 years ago. But it was purchased maybe like summer 2017 or early 2018, I think. I think it was before I got married, which was summer 2018. It was like a new computer because it needed to like last me, it needed to be reliable, all these different types of things. And as you guys as you probably know, you guys are all in the tech world, Apple comes up with new updates basically every year, and they're free and you can download them and that's great. But as with all kind of new updates, OS updates, and stuff like that, I waited for the first update. So I was like, you know, I'm going to wait until it's like a little bit later in the launch and, you know, it's a little bit stable. I'm not just going to install it first thing. Well, as in my memory, this was just a few months ago. But recently I was going in, actually I think it might've been to adjust my mic or something for this show. Yay, you can see my face now. And I was digging around in my settings and Kevin was saying, oh, well, you should see this or this. And I was like, well, I don't see that at all. And I looked and my operating system was out of date. So I was like, okay, well, that's easy. Mac has operating systems. It turns out that my operating system is like several operating systems out of date. I can't even install the newest one. I have to like manually install one of the older ones and like batch it on top. And I consider myself a tech savvy person, although I'm not, on the level with some of the like developers and super tech people that we work with. And this whole thing has just turned into a little bit of a frustrating nightmare where I just want to update my like pretty much new computer. Again, in my head, it's pretty much new to the newest OS. It doesn't even require paying. Normally they're bugging you to do it all the time, but it's so difficult because the slow change just caught up with me over time. The change was happening. There's just one thing a year. That's pretty slow. But I wasn't keeping on top of it, and now I'm behind. And if any of you guys are experts on this or have experienced this problem, please call me, help me. Just kidding. I'll probably get Kevin to do it one of these days, or to help me with it one of these days. But yeah, it's just industry changes, technology changes, especially in our industry. They happen slowly, but they also happen pretty quickly. So they are important to keep on top of.
So true. And I guess I had a last type of change on here. It's not its own separate type of change. It's mostly just a reminder to everyone that change can be good too. I have a good change on here. And I guess, for example, again, it's kind of timely, is I'm having a baby. That's a very good change. I'm very excited about it. And so, you can have good expected change. You can have good sudden change, like if you win the lottery. Anyway, there's all sorts of good changes. But most of the time, these also require you to adapt around it. Because it's still a type of change that you plan for. And so even if a change is good, like if you win the lottery, that's really exciting. If you don't have a plan for it, or you don't have any way to like manage your money or the funds or whatever, you're just going to find out that you've like spent it all in a month on monogram jet skis and you're back to where you were.
Yeah. I would even go so far as to say that change happens, period. There are big changes. There are small changes. Sometimes you don't know what one is going to be while you're going through it. But you have the power to make change, even very, like bad or problematic or scary change, into good change based on how you adapt to it. Right? Like, okay, this is going to sound terrible. This is just a totally abstract example off the top of my head. But let's say, you having a baby is a really good change for you. This could be like a nightmare change for the business. It's not. I'm really happy that you're having a kid and stuff. Another kid to join your family. If, let's say, you were the only person who knew how to do anything and there were no written down processes, and, like we were going to absolutely lose you 100% for a full year, and I didn't care personally about you or your well-being in your life, like that's exact same thing, which could be really amazing for Celene, could be, even if we're in full support of her, really, really challenging for the business. Now, again, this is an expected change, so you have a lot of opportunity, but I just want to leave you guys with the idea that, even if we kind of flip, this was taking something that was really good and kind of making it into something bad, like even a change that can be really, really problematic. Like for instance, COVID coming and like killing all of your business for a while or something, right? I'm not trying to downplay the severity of that, but that bad change, if you actually like harness that power and move on from it and use it, can actually catalyze good changes in your life and can turn into something good. Just one last really quick example on this, and this is a little bit of a heavier example, but I was listening to a podcast yesterday where a woman was talking about her diagnosis with breast cancer. And, even though she'd been cancer-free for some years and stuff, but she actually repeatedly in the podcast spoke of having breast cancer as almost one of the best things that happened to her in her life. Because before that, she didn't understand how to say no. She didn't understand how to set boundaries. She was holding on to a lot of things inside of her and a lot of relationships that really weren't serving her. And because of that diagnosis, it pushed her into making a change. It pushed her into setting boundaries and saying no and discovering who she was as an individual and deciding what she wanted out of her relationships. And now is actually in this podcast, she's like a 60-something-year-old thought leader who is using the wealth of experience that she's had in her life and all of these different things to actually go and inspire other people into that. So something that, most people would agree that getting cancer is a pretty intense experience and wouldn't necessarily call that good, But for her, with time and perspective and the choices that she made from it, she herself was describing that as one of the best things that happened in her life. And that really like shook me. I was like, wow, change can be good.
Yeah, because it sounds like she was very mindful of it, and she basically went through, not necessarily the same process that we're going to use, but she went through like an intentional process of using that negative change to spur positive, like as a catalyst for positive change in her life.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you get there, right? Like how can we turn these types of changes that we don't expect, we often don't like, we often want to resist, into these powerful catalysts for growth and fulfillment?
Well, I mean, I guess we're probably going to be mostly kind of talking about this from the perspective of unexpected change because it's the most complicated to deal with. But any type of change, you can pretty much use the same kind of framework or what we're talking about for it. But just it's usually simpler because you have the time and the foresight to deal with it. But when something changes, especially when it's sudden, you kind of go through some sort of emotional reactive process. It's, depending on whether it is like a key employee suddenly leaving without notice or you getting a new phone, like the level of emotional reactive process. I don't know if my phone was pretty traumatic. It's going to be different. But usually it starts with, you're surprised, you're shocked, you found out about some sort of change. And then you go through whatever kind of process it is you go through. And it ends with hopefully acceptance and determination, where, sometimes that also happens in the space of 5 minutes where you're like, oh my goodness, okay, how do we deal with this? And sometimes it takes longer to process, again, depending on the nature of the change. And you know what? I've worked with a lot of people like this as well. Some people just straight up refuse to accept change. And they just go on with the exact same thing that they've always been doing. I know my husband worked for a company that sold a software. This was a long time ago. And he didn't realize what it was when he accepted the job, but he like quickly realized that the software they were selling was so obsolete, completely replaced by like Gmail, and Gmail being like a way better product. But this guy had been like selling the same software for 10 years, and he just refused to accept that it was obsolete. It had never changed. His like sales tactics were super cheesy and hadn't changed. And so this, when people don't accept change, they just keep doing the same thing they were already doing, which pretty much no longer works. And so I'm going to say right now, that's like the wrong way to deal with change. Usually there isn't like a right or a wrong answer, but to bury your head in the sand and pretend nothing's changing is the wrong answer.
Yeah, I will second that. And really what I'm hearing when I'm pulling out of what you're saying, which I think is so valuable, is that the process of dealing with change, even though we're going to give you some like physical action driven things to do, is an emotional one as much as it is a kind of logistical or process driven or action driven one. And you probably won't start out by feeling, acceptance and like arms wide open, embracing it and stuff. Let's just be real. Sometimes, yeah, but a lot of the time, no. But part of the process, what I'm hearing from you, Celene, is that part of the process is coming to that emotional space of acceptance and determination. And sometimes I think this even has a little bit of like a grief process associated with it. Grief being the process of letting go of something that you're not ready to let go of, right? And sometimes even an anger element to it, right? Where you're like, like, why does it have to be this way? This doesn't serve me. I feel angry because it's not fair that the circumstances come up, etc. And all of those are normal. We're not saying that you should just totally suppress and get rid of those emotions, that you won't have those emotions at the end. Simply to understand that when change is coming up and, all these emotions are springing up, there are ways to move through those emotions and aim for a place of acceptance and determination, and just know that that's coming, right? Like if you're working towards it, it might take you a while, it might be difficult, but you will get there. And the more you can nurture those feelings within yourself without stomping out and pretending those other emotions don't exist, right? Because the same way you don't want to ignore the change, you also don't want to ignore your like feelings around it. But that doesn't mean that you want to pour gasoline on that fire or feed into those negative emotions, right? When we're saying accept that you might grieve or feel angry, that doesn't mean like throw a rage fit and like throw things around. There's this thing my husband loves called hammer block, where like you just literally go and take a hammer and like hammer at in our case, a stump, like our firewood splitting stump. It's not about the feelings you feel. It's about how you express and move through those emotions. And so even while we're going through this process, don't forget that this is an emotional process as much as a physical one.
Especially if it is, a very like traumatic or emotional type of change, like a health issue or death, or even like if it's a death of a business that you had that was your baby for years or whatever it may be. Like there are a lot of types of change, especially when they're very negative, that are almost certainly going to cause you to have a lot of emotions. Although today we're going to focus on like the logistical aspect of it, because I don't like talking about my feelings. I'm just kidding. It's because that is like a whole other completely different issue that many people have talked on.
Yep. And, I will bring in where appropriate, just where I can bring in my own experience around like emotions with this process. But I will also just say this before we get into it, is that if you are having difficulty navigating change on an emotional level, there is no shame in seeking out professional support like therapy, counseling, that kind of a thing. Sometimes these big changes, whether they're in our personal life or whether they're in our business, really are big and traumatic and hard to get through. And I will be the first to say that having someone whose job basically is to help me feel heard and help me navigate it and stuff, not every therapist I've been to has been a fit, but finding someone who is a fit, who can help you navigate through this emotional space if it's feeling too big or too overwhelming, that's not just okay, but it can be transcendental and amazing. And turning, your spouse, your partner, your business partner, etc., into your therapist isn't fair to you or them.
That is so true.
Yeah. All right. So with that out of the way, what are some of the steps? We have a 3-step process for you, just at a high level before we get into it. What are the 3 steps to adapting well to change, Celene?
First of all, I just have to say that like rereading my notes from what I made before, our steps to handling and adapting change have a lot of overlap with our steps, our IDS, identify, discuss, solve process for solving problems, which I guess probably shouldn't surprise me, but just looking at this, I'm like, oh, actually. So the 3 kind of steps at a high level are 1, to identify what these disruptions are. So figure out like what actually is the change, because a lot of times changes ripple throughout things that you even don't expect, to smaller things. Like there's kind of the big obvious, and this is not a high level anymore, so I'm going to move on.
Okay.
Identify what these disruptions are. 2 is to make a plan for mitigation. Like how are you going to handle this change? What are you going to do? And 3, which is I think a very often forgotten step, is reevaluate what your plan is and whether it's working and accomplishing what you were hoping it would.
Yeah, reevaluate regularly, not just like once in a year or something.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so those 3 steps, once again, so 3 steps to adapting well to change. Number 1, identifying the disruptions. Number 2, making a plan of mitigation. And I love that word. We'll get into why we chose that word in a bit. And 3, reevaluate regularly. So there you go. Super simple. End of episode. Just kidding. So what goes into identifying the disruptions, Celene?
Well, as I kind of started to say before I pulled myself off of that tangent, is that, like usually the change, the catalyst itself, it's pretty obvious. Like something happens, or sometimes a couple things happen at once, but the change itself is usually pretty obvious, but not as obvious are all the like different kind of things it touches or affects. And I mean, obviously this is a pretty big change that we've spent a lot of time talking about, but going back to the maternity leave thing too, is we originally had like, oh, these are kind of the big things that we listed off and thought about. And then, after you sit with it for a while, you're like, oh, but what about this? Oh, I forgot about that. There's always going to be more things, and you're not necessarily going to get them all the first time you sit down. But one thing you can do is you can just start a list or a mind map. You can even start, hierarchizing information is something we do all the time. So you can start grouping it by like, okay, these are the things that are like the highest priority that we're 100% sure are going to be affected. And then maybe start like another kind of or next category is things that like may be affected, but you're not really sure yet. You have to kind of see how things play out. And then things that probably won't be affected, but you want to keep an eye on just in case, and have it kind of on your radar. So obviously when you start to kind of move into number 2, like you'll focus on the things that are the biggest impact, very obvious things, but you don't want to forget about the other things too, and then find out like way down the road that you've let something slide and now it's become its own kind of big monster problem to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. And just real talking this, especially on an emotional level, identifying the disruptions, the earlier you start to identify these things, the better it will probably go for you, your problem solving, your psyche. You know, the problems change over time. And I know I am not the only one who sees a problem come up and sometimes hopes, hey, maybe if I just ignore that problem, it'll solve itself. And that does happen like 1% of the time. But most of the time, like even if a problem is going to solve itself, just putting the problem down on paper, you know? So once again, there's a change. If something has happened super unexpectedly that you don't realize, let's say, if we're talking about unexpected change, let's say a key staff member who does a lot that's really important to your team, all of a sudden came down with a family emergency and isn't going to be available for a week or heck, a month. What do you do? Right? Like panicking, I mean, okay, maybe that will be like fun or like relieving for a very short time. But I've tried panicking in these kinds of situations and I've decided it's not for me. It doesn't actually help. And I just end up feeling way crappier and not being prepared at the end of it, just being more stressed. But breaking it down, right? Like a big issue is almost always made up of little issues. Right. So if we're identifying the disruptions, if we're taking that example of, you know, a key employee who's suddenly gone, and this is not an example we prepare. So this is just, let's go through the process off the top of our head. Right. So a few disruptions, let's say they are a project manager style person. So there's going to be nobody to talk to clients, let's say, or there's going to be nobody to hold the, let's say, designers and developers accountable to their deadlines. What are some other disruptions that might come out of that in a hypothetical scenario, Celene?
I think even things like depending on, you know, the relationship with the team is like kind of the team morale or dynamics of, I mean, in this case, it's a family emergency, but if someone is like gone on maybe less good terms, there's rippling effects there. It's like, how is it going to affect the team? How is it going to affect our financial plans? Like, do we have, again, this is like a month thing. So do we hire someone temp, or do we know if they're coming back? Are we saving money because we're not, you know, paying their salary, or maybe we are paying part of their salary of some sort of bereavement thing? Or what's it going to cost to get a temp person in? Are we going to have to train them? Are our processes up to date? I'm just like snowballing. Like my level of panic is rising as I'm snowballing all these issues, which is why it's helpful to make a list.
Yes. And that's the thing, is that when you start to snowball in your head, the disruptions, they are literally infinite. Like the same thing will come back and like wake you up in the middle of the night 2 days later that you thought about 2 days before. And you're like, oh, that thing, oh my God, it's worse than I thought. Like this is never, and you just end up with this like mountain of different issues in your head. But if you actually challenge yourself, and this is something, you're right, there is a lot of overlap also with our like boss, how to organize like a boss process. But if you just take the time to brainstorm all of the different issues without worrying about solving them, and I've ranted about this before and I'll rant about it again, I think this is a really critical element, is when you're identifying the disruptions, don't worry about mitigation or solutions. Sometimes things will come up as you're writing them down. That's fine. You can jot them down, you know, like potential solutions or ideas or whatever, but just make a massive list of all of the different things, because that list is finite. Even if you have your whole leadership team, which for us is 2 people, I know some businesses who might have more like 5 or 6 people on the leadership team, although not very many, you know, that work that you're doing, that all of a sudden is something that you can tackle, you can manage, you can work with, you can organize, you can clarify, you can simplify, versus in your head, it's like you're trying to hold sand through like open fingers, right? Like you're trying to hold like spiky sand through panicky open fingers. Like it's just like, you're just constantly trying to hold it back up and it's slipping through your hands. And it's very difficult to get your emotional shit together, to be honest, when everything's a little bit of a freak out, versus when you're watching that list rise on paper, yeah, there's this like kind of panic feeling, but eventually the list stops growing. Like eventually everyone's exhausted with all the different ideas and thoughts and plans and stuff. And you can always come back to it later and there'll be more stuff to add. But this is now something concrete that you can work with. And I'll just leave you with this before we move on to number 2, which is that on that emotional level, if you're feeling tempted to play the ostrich and stick your head in the sand or to just sweep things under the rug, the sooner that you can start writing these things down, the more time you have for solutions to organically appear, for problems to magically solve themselves, etc. Because yeah, that does happen from time to time. If you've already identified it and put it down, you can also get other brains on it. But if you're waiting till it's already an emergency, which, yeah, okay, if this person let you know immediately, it's an emergency, but guaranteed, if you're doing this in a day or two after, let's say the person told you they have a family emergency, they're going to be gone, versus a week into chaos land, it's going to go differently. I'll tell you that.
So true. And before I move on to the next one, I will also say, we talked about the snowballing and getting overwhelmed part. I've also seen people who, it's the opposite. They get tunnel vision. They focus on like one thing where it's going to impact, like they're like, oh no, if you lose a job, you're just focused just on the finances or something. It's also very easy to get tunnel vision and focus on only one type of, or one solution for one of the effects of it, and drop the balls on everything else until they've snowballed themselves.
Agreed. Agreed.
Yeah. So I will move on to number 2, which is my most favorite part, which is where you actually get to come up with, a plan of mitigation. What are you going to do now to kind of solve these problems? If your list is really long, and like, let's be real, my lists are always really long. It's not realistic to just immediately address everything. You will get overwhelmed. You will get burnt out. You will start panicking because you'll be like, there's no way I could ever solve all of these problems at once. The very first step is to prioritize. So I know I said, like in the kind of the first step where you're listing everything down, you can kind of categorize it either by priority or by like, for sure problems, maybe, maybe it will be affected, probably won't be. But then once you have kind of your highest priority ones, is just choose like maybe your top 3 biggest things to tackle that are either because they're going to have the soonest impact or require the soonest, like most immediate intervention, or sometimes just because they're 3 things you can control that are easy to do that you can start taking positive action towards.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, if in doubt, go for the like biggest, hairiest, most like painful problems, because those are the ones that, even though they're painful to tackle, even if you only spend a whole meeting talking about one, clarifying that will do a lot more than getting rid of, say, like 20 tiny things. But if you are feeling like, what I'm hearing from you, Celene, is that if you're feeling like paralyzed and you're like, oh gosh, I don't know what to do, I feel too overwhelmed, I'm like procrastinating, picking 3 things that you can just put back under your control and giving yourself those quick wins is a good way to motivate yourself forward so that you can move on to those like bigger, hairier, more thorny issues, so to speak.
Yes. And speaking of, being paralyzed and overwhelmed, the next kind of thing I would recommend doing is to bring other people in on this. Like, you don't need to shoulder this alone. Whether you have other people who are kind of consulting or brainstorming, there's a couple of things. You want to make sure everyone's on the same page. You want to make sure that you have outside perspective, maybe because other people are familiar with whatever is going on or it affects them, or because you are having an emotional reaction and you need that outside perspective. So kind of, get the inside and outside perspective if necessary, or just amazing ideas. And also because if there's going to be a lot of kind of steps that need to be taken, spreading around the love and delegating all the different action items is going to make it a lot easier on you.
Yeah. Agreed. And what can be a huge, thorny, terrible issue for you that feels impossible to solve? When you ask someone else, or better yet, when you get into a room with other like minds and critical thinkers, it just blows my mind sometimes how much simpler it becomes to solve that issue, where that thing that felt totally impossible by the end that felt totally impossible at the beginning. By the end of sometimes only 10 minutes of conversation, you have the rough outline of a plan. And again, we're going for like progress over perfection, excellence over perfection. It's not about having the perfect plan where all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. It's about having a starting place. Kind of often it's a rough and dirty plan that people can start taking action on immediately, that will start to mitigate, or if not at least mitigate, then at least change the problem. Because this is, embracing the whole fail fast mentality and stuff as well. Sometimes even if you can't fix the problem, if you can change the problem, you can tweak and change the problem into something you can fix over time.
So true. And even though we call it like a rough and dirty plan, it doesn't have to be perfect. One thing that's very important is to make sure that you have clear steps and action items with person responsible and deadlines and timelines, so stuff actually gets done. Because it's very, 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 very easy to make up a plan, feel really good about it, and then like check in a couple weeks later and nothing's been done. And depending on what type of changes happened, like a week or two, even a couple of days of not addressing a problem can be really critical.
Yeah. And I would say leverage your existing rhythms and cycles. So if you've listened to this podcast before, then you know that we have, like weekly team pulse check-ins, we have quarterly meetings, even in my personal life, because it works so well in business, I have an adapted version called like a relationship radar, which I do both with my partners and with my closest friends, and a lot of the time we slip topics into these rhythms to make sure we don't forget about them, right? So if you don't have any like pulse meetings or next meetings set, make sure when you're having your like plan of mitigation meeting to set when the next meeting or when regular meetings are going to happen so that you can keep reevaluating and looking at this, as we're about to get to. But also don't be afraid, like when we've been discussing like these like larger, bigger things and changes and etc. Sometimes outside of our L10, we'll actually put the follow-up issues or things we need to check in on or things that we need to clarify later because we're starting to feel a bit burnt out or something. We'll put that on that list so it doesn't get forgotten. It's getting reprioritized every meeting and every week. And that's the other thing, is that if you're making a long list, prioritizing 3 things, tackling them in order, and then kind of starting over again, which is the process that we're telling you here, don't be afraid to reprioritize every single time, because what was the most important issue last time you talked about it sometimes isn't the most important issue this time, because context and timing and deadlines and opportunities are all changing all the time.
This is starting to sound more and more like our IDS process.
I know. Well, I guess it turns out that change is just a bigger problem to solve.
That is true.
Yeah.
And I guess the final step, which is the most, I guess all the steps are really important steps. There's no one that's more important than others. But a really important step is to reevaluate. And I mean, this is particularly true for ongoing or changing change, like when COVID first hit and things were changing all the time. But even to reevaluate and revisit regularly with like a single catalyst change, because your understanding of how things will change or how the change is affecting things will continue to evolve as you go through it. Or maybe your mindset, maybe like your understanding of the change or the change itself hasn't changed. I'm using the word change a lot. Hasn't changed, but your emotional reaction to it might be different once you've had some time to step back and think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing, right? Is that there's these big, huge like changes that happen like a bomb landing in your life, but they're never the end of it, right? Nothing exists in a vacuum. We are constantly evolving and adapting and growing and interacting and taking advantage of opportunities and stuff. And that's not going to stop, even though sometimes it feels like the whole world stops, in particular when certain types of change happen, and like especially grieving or bereavement or stuff like that. But the reality is that the world will keep turning, things will keep changing, and it is important to just come back to things, see how they've changed. See, now I'm using it. I will also say this as well, and this is something that my business mentor really kind of drove home for me with COVID in particular, and again, will sound like something we say often, but the data, as much as, especially when you're going through a really emotional experience, like dealing with a big, sudden, unexpected change, as much as you can lean on the data and look at the data and use the data as a reference point, data is not quite so unemotional as we like to pretend it is, right? We have stories and spins and all these different things. Someone with blinders on, and I've been that person, even if the data is selling them something different, may not listen. It's also a good reason to bring other people in. But when it comes to business stuff, do make data part of your plan of mitigation and part of your reevaluation. You know, when COVID hit, we did like a 5 scenario. I say we, Celene, sweet, beautiful goddess, Celene. You made this just amazing, amazing cash flow document that looked at all of these different scenarios, right? That actually broke down what are some of our decisions? What would that look like? What would that carry through? I mean, obviously, all of those were just, what's the word I'm looking for? Guesses, like reinforced guesses. I'm having a brain fart on the word there. But at the same time, it was like, oh my gosh, when we're looking at this on paper and starting to like plan out what our decisions might look like on paper, especially, you know, like financially related ones, that not only helped like center me against the emotional kind of like waves and freak out and either burn it to the ground or throw myself in 10 times harder or all these different types of things. But it also helped us couple the emotion with, well, just confidence, right? Confidence, because it's like, this isn't 100% what it's going to look like, but we've modeled it out and we're making a much more informed decision.
Yeah. And also in that example, the very, like, I kind of had like a best, average, and worst case scenario. And then for each one had like kind of multiple options of what we could do. But every time, like the very, very, very worst case scenario where like the world was like completely shut down was still not that bad. Like it was still like, oh, you know what? We can do this. Like obviously it wouldn't be our first choice, but you know what? Like the worst case scenario, like, because in your head emotionally, you're like, the world is ending, the business is over, I'm going to be homeless. I don't know. But like when you go on paper and you're like, what is actually the worst case scenario? And I'm like, oh, you know what? We can do that.
Yeah, that's actually something I use in my personal life all the time to navigate change, is thinking about, okay, this thing happened. I lost my wallet, for example. What is the worst case scenario with losing my wallet? Like, obviously someone could steal my information and do all this big stuff, but I'm like, realistically, the worst case scenario, maybe a better example is I lost my wallet. I'm concerned it's stolen, right? So the worst case scenario, okay, I don't get my wallet back. I'm going to have to call these things, shut down my cards, maybe have to jump through some hoops, get a new ID, get a new thing. And it's like, yeah, is that a great thought? No. But that thought reminds me, oh, right, that's not the end of the world. Because when I immediately lose my wallet, my brain is piling on stress and the potential bad happenings. But quite often when you just center it in, okay, what does the worst case scenario actually look like? As Celene said, it's like, wow, that's not as bad. That's not as bad as I thought. That's actually, I can deal with it. I can live with that. And it's not that you want to like dwell on that and be like, yeah, worst case scenario, everything's going to be crap, like, etc. It's actually to give you that oomph and that push that you need to keep going and move on, because it's probably not going to be the worst case scenario. Yeah. All right, so just kind of wrapping us up and recapping that. So once again, change happens. It happens sometimes in an expected way, sometimes unexpected, huge, intense, etc. And sometimes it happens slowly without even you really realizing it until all of a sudden the world's different. But no matter what type of change you're experiencing, it's always an emotional experience as well as a logistical and physical experience. You always have to deal with it on the emotional side and move towards acceptance and determination, not just, frantically do things while panicking. And the 3 steps that we use for handling and adapting quickly and well to change are: number 1, identifying the disruptions; number 2, making a plan of mitigation; and number 3, reevaluating that plan regularly; and, embracing failing fast, basically embracing action. did you have any final thoughts to add or any other kind of gems or words of wisdom to share, Celene?
Oh, now I feel very put on the spot. I think the most important thing is to just remember that no matter what type of change you're experiencing or that happens, you're always going to get through it. Life goes on, business goes on, and sometimes like changes happen in your business where it feels like you're like, oh, this is going to set us back 3 years or something. Like there can be really scary changes in business. Like maybe you lose a client that's like half of your recurring income or something. I mean, you probably hopefully don't rely on one client for half your income, but things like that happen. And change can be really scary, but things tend, people are really resilient and good at moving forward. And so are you. You can do it. That's my motivational speech today.
Awesome. No, actually, I really like that, right? Like that is another thing that I remind myself often, which is that one way or another, things are going to work out. I may not always be happy with the way things work out. They may not work out the way I expect. Often they don't work out the way I expect, but things are always going to work out one way or another. And I agree with Celene. You have the power. It may not feel like it sometimes, but you do have that power to be resilient, to adapt to change, and to embrace it.
And to take control of the change and instead of just letting it overpower you and run its course, you can actually, like if there's some sort of big rush coming down a river, you have the power to kind of change the course and direct it as opposed to just like getting washed away in it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because not making a decision is still a decision. And that is the decision, not, being paralyzed, not making any decisions at all, and just letting things steamroll over and overwhelm you. That's the quickest way to drown in it. Absolutely. All right, guys, this has been excellent as always. I hope that each of you listening has an excellent rest of your day. If you're not having a great day, what can you do to take control of the change that you're not super stoked about in your life right now and today? Just one thing, one little thing. Just separate what you can control, what you can't control, and try and focus on something you can control and make a change there. All right, guys, take care and have a good one.